In April of 1955, Grace Kelly sat in the Pantages Theater in Hollywood holding an Academy Award for Best Actress. She was 26 years old. The statuette was warm in her hands, heavier than people expect the first time they hold one, and the audience around her was applauding. She had just beaten Judy Garland, who had given what many people in that room privately considered the performance of the decade in A Star Is Born. Grace had won for The Country Girl, playing a mousy, unglamorous wife, deliberately stripped of the looks she'd spent years being told were all she had. She smiled the way she always smiled in public. Composed, unreadable. The expression of someone who has learned very young that being watched requires a specific kind of stillness. 14 months later, she was gone. Not dead, not disgraced. Gone. Voluntarily, completely, and at the precise moment when every door in the industry stood open for her. She married a prince, moved to a small Mediterranean principality most Americans couldn't find on a map, and never made another film. She was 26 when she won the Oscar. She was 27 when she walked away. The question that stays with you once you spend any real time with the details of her life is not why she left. The question is what she was leaving from. Grace Patricia Kelly was born on November 12, 1929, in Philadelphia, into a family that had built itself into local prominence through a combination of physical labor, political connections, and a very specific kind of Irish Catholic ambition that recognized the difference between being respected and being accepted, and wanted both. Her father, John B. Kelly, had won 3 Olympic gold medals in rowing, 1920 and 1924, and had then translated that discipline into a construction business that made him a millionaire before the Depression had finished ruining other men. Jack Kelly was not a cruel father in any obvious way. He was simply a man who had very clear ideas about what constituted worth, and those ideas did not naturally include his third child. He wanted sons who could row. He got them. Kel, his eldest boy, would go on to compete at Henley, doing what Jack had been refused permission to do because the Royal Henley Regatta had barred him in 1920 on the grounds that he was a manual laborer. The revenge Jack Kelly took on the British class system through his son's athletic record is its own story. Grace existed in a different register of his attention. She was pretty, which he noted. She was not athletic enough to hold his interest for long. She had something interior and private about her from early childhood, a quality of watching rather than performing that would later make her extraordinary on screen, but that read in the Kelly household as distance. Her mother, Margaret Major Kelly, had been a model and a physical education instructor, the first woman to coach athletics at the University of Pennsylvania. She was beautiful in a severe, contained way, and she held herself with a posture that admitted no softness. Margaret loved her children, but love in the Kelly family was expressed through expectation rather than tenderness. Grace, the middle daughter between Peggy and Lisanne, seems to have found her own company early. She read, she sewed costumes, she performed plays in her bedroom for audiences of one. Her uncle, George Kelly, was a playwright, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a man who understood that stories could be made from ordinary rooms and ordinary silences. He was the one adult in her childhood who saw what she was doing when she disappeared into performance, not escaping, but translating. He took her seriously before anyone else did. She went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York at 17, which required a level of determination that the family narrative tends to underplay. Jack Kelly did not think acting was a respectable profession. He told her so more than once, and in terms that were not gentle. She went anyway, which tells you something. She modeled to pay her tuition, magazines, advertisements, the kind of work that required standing still and giving the camera exactly what it wanted, which she could do almost instinctively. Her face was symmetrical in the way that photographs love. Her bone structure was the kind that lighting designers spend careers waiting for. She was already being described in the trade publications in terms that reduced her to her appearance, and she already understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has been underestimated by people she respected, that this was a problem to be worked around rather than a problem to be corrected. Her early television and stage work in New York is genuinely under-examined in most accounts of her life. She was doing live television drama, Kraft Television Theater, Philco Television Playhouse, at a moment when live television was its own demanding, unforgiving discipline. There were no second takes. If you forgot a line or misread a cue, the camera was already on you and the audience was already watching, and you had to solve the problem in real time. She was good at this. Directors noticed she had an unusual ability to stay inside a scene even when things went wrong around her, to maintain whatever the character required without breaking into her own panic. Her film debut was in 14 Hours in 1951, a small part, barely a part at all. High Noon came the following year, opposite Gary Cooper, and it was there that something shifted. Fred Zinnemann, the director, said later that what struck him about her was that she didn't perform anxiety, she produced it. There is a difference. Performers who produce anxiety from inside themselves rather than indicating it from outside are rarer than casting calls suggest, and Zinnemann recognized what he had. Cooper, 41 to her 22 and already moving with the careful economy of a man whose body had started to argue back, responded to her in ways that were not entirely professional. The relationship they developed during production was, by most accounts, real. Not a studio-manufactured publicity item. Grace kept it private. She kept most things private. John Ford cast her in Mogambo in 1953 in Africa, opposite Clark Gable and Ava Gardner. The film itself is less interesting than what the production revealed about Grace's method of navigating male attention on a set. Gable, 52, was in the middle of his life, falling apart around him. His wife had recently died. He was drinking. He was the kind of man who had been glamorous for so long that he no longer entirely believed in the version of himself the studio maintained. He fell for Grace, or something he understood as falling. She managed this with a composure that the people who were watching described differently depending on their sympathies. Some saw warmth and discretion, others saw calculation. What it actually was, in all likelihood, was a young woman who understood that the men she worked with were frequently more fragile than they appeared, and that managing their emotional states was part of the job. Ava Gardner, who was not fragile and who did not need managing, liked her. That is worth noting. Ava Gardner's opinions of her female co-stars were not generally charitable. Rear Window in 1954 was the first of 4 films Grace made with Alfred Hitchcock, and it was in this collaboration that the full range of what she could do became visible in a way that earlier roles had not permitted. Hitchcock had a theory about her that he articulated in various forms to various interviewers over the years that followed, that behind the cool surface there was fire, that the restraint was the point rather than the cover, that audiences would feel what she wasn't showing more intensely than they would feel what another actress openly displayed. He was right, and he built the visual grammar of Rear Window around proving it. Lisa Fremont appears in the film's opening like a hallucination, descending toward a sleeping Jimmy Stewart, kissing him awake, moving through his small apartment in clothes that cost more than the apartment itself. She is simultaneously the most decorative person in any frame she occupies, and the one who turns out to be right about everything that matters. Hitchcock gave her, for the first time on screen, a character whose intelligence was the plot. Dial M for Murder came out the same year, 1954. So did The Country Girl. Grace Kelly made 3 significant films in a single calendar year, and in all 3 she was doing something different. Decorative menace, psychological realism, unglamorous truth. The range was not something the studio system was equipped to reward or even properly see. The studio system rewarded type. Grace was not a type. The Academy gave her the Oscar for The Country Girl on March 30th, 1955. George Seaton directed it. Bing Crosby played her husband, an alcoholic actor whose failure she had organized her life around enduring. The role required her to look tired and worn and complicit in her own diminishment, and she did this without protective irony, without the small signals an actress sometimes sends to the audience to indicate that she knows she's better than the role. She disappeared into it. Crosby, who was not a generous scene partner by reputation, said afterward that working with her had surprised him. The night she won, Marlon Brando was in the audience. He had been nominated for On the Waterfront, which he ultimately won in a different category at a different ceremony. The records are occasionally confusing on this point. But the point is that this was not a year of weak competition. Judy Garland had given A Star is Born everything she had, which in 1954 was considerable and also visibly costly. And the people who voted against her were voting against the chaos and suffering she had made visible, not against the performance. Grace Kelly's win was, among other things, an industry choosing order over exposure. She was in Monaco 9 months later. The meeting between Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier III of Monaco happened in April 1955, during the Cannes Film Festival, and the details of how it unfolded have been told in various versions, some more flattering than others. A delegation was sent. A visit to the palace was arranged. A photographer from Paris Match was present, which means the earliest images of their first real interaction are documented in the peculiar, posed way that magazine journalism of that era managed its subjects. Rainier was 31, had been ruling Monaco since he was 26, and was under genuine constitutional pressure to produce an heir or risk the principality reverting to France under the terms of a treaty signed in 1918. He needed a wife. He needed her to be Catholic, presentable, and fertile. Whether he needed her to be Grace Kelly specifically is a question his later behavior answered ambiguously. Grace went back to America. Letters were exchanged, real ones, written on paper, carried across the Atlantic. The correspondence lasted through the summer and into the fall. She was filming High Society in the autumn of 1955, the MGM musical remake of the Philadelphia Story, and she was also simultaneously deciding whether to marry a man she had met twice. Her father's reaction to the news was not what might have been expected. Jack Kelly, who had spent 20 years refusing to believe his daughter's profession was respectable, who had watched her win an Academy Award with something closer to bewilderment than pride, now found himself confronted with a prince. He was not immediately charmed. He told at least one interviewer that he wasn't sure what Rainier actually did for a living. This was either genuine ignorance or deliberate deflation. And with Jack Kelly, it was never entirely clear which impulse was operating. The engagement was announced on January 5, 1956. The American press responded with a volume and enthusiasm that surprised Monaco's communications office, which was not organized for anything like the coverage that followed. Grace Kelly was famous in a specific way that movie stars of the mid-1950s were famous, ubiquitous in a certain stratum of the culture, aspirationally present on magazine covers and in advertisements, the face that a particular era of American femininity had decided to agree upon as its ideal. Marrying her off to an actual European monarch was a story that wrote itself, and every publication in the country wrote it. MGM had her under contract. The studio did not want to lose her, which was commercially rational. She was, at 26, at the beginning of what should have been 15 or 20 more years of bankable work. They offered to renegotiate, to restructure, to give her whatever she wanted if she stayed. She didn't stay. What exactly she told the studio in those conversations has never been fully documented. What is known is that she fulfilled the remainder of her existing obligation, finished High Society, and then was done. High Society is, in retrospect, a strange film to end on. It is not her best work. It is professionally accomplished and emotionally thin. A big-budget entertainment built around Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, competing for the affections of a character who is essentially a trophy in a dress. Grace plays Tracy Lord with the minimum required investment, present, technically exact, giving Sinatra and Crosby what they need from her, without the kind of interior commitment she had brought to Rear Window or The Country Girl. The song she performs with Sinatra, True Love, was recorded separately and released as a single, and it sold well. She did not sing it particularly well. It didn't matter. She sailed to Monaco on the SS Constitution in April 1956 with her family, her friends, her dog, and 80 pieces of luggage. The crossing took 8 days. The flotilla of boats that came out to meet the ship when it entered Monaco's waters included a vessel carrying Rainier and also a vessel carrying several dozen journalists, which gives you the essential image: the prince and the press arriving simultaneously to claim her. The civil ceremony was on April 18th. The religious ceremony was on April 19th. The world watched both, because MGM had negotiated the film rights and the broadcast rights, and the whole apparatus of mid-century media had arranged itself around the event. It was the most watched television broadcast in European history up to that point. Hitchcock sent a telegram. The message has been quoted in various forms. The gist was warm and brief. She became Her Serene Highness Princess Grace of Monaco. And the question of what that actually meant in daily terms took the better part of a decade to answer. The practical reality of Monaco was not the fairy tale the press had narrated. The principality was small, roughly the size of Central Park, and its economy ran on a casino that Rainier was in the process of modernizing and diversifying. A project that required diplomatic work and political maneuvering and the kind of sustained institutional attention that doesn't photograph well. Grace was expected to attend functions, to represent the principality, to produce children, to behave in every public moment with the kind of unbroken composure that she had, it turned out, been practicing her entire life without knowing that was what she was preparing for. Caroline was born in January 1957, Albert in March 1958, Stephanie in February 1965. Grace managed 3 pregnancies in 8 years while running a palace and learning a new country and navigating a marriage to a man who was, by most accounts, territorial and occasionally cold, and who had a temper that did not find its way into the official record, but that people close to the family discussed in memoirs and interviews published after both their deaths. The Hollywood offers kept coming. They came for years. Hitchcock wrote to her directly, asking her to return for Marnie, the role of a compulsive thief and trauma survivor that he had conceived with her in mind. She wanted to do it. She said yes. The announcement was made. And then Monaco erupted. The Monegasque press and public responded to the idea of their princess playing a criminal with an anger that apparently shocked her. She had not anticipated that the citizens of her adopted country would have opinions about her professional choices that she would be required to defer to. Rainier, whatever his private position was, made his public one clear: she would not make the film. Tippi Hedren was cast. Marnie came out in 1964, and Hitchcock never fully forgave the situation, though what exactly he blamed and who he blamed it on varied depending on the interview. The offers didn't stop after Marnie. They slowed, and then they became rarer, and then they became a subject Grace no longer discussed in public. She turned toward what was available. She started a flower pressing hobby that grew over years into genuine expertise. She eventually wrote and illustrated a book about it, My Book of Flowers, published in 1980, which is not a vanity project, but an actual researched work on the subject of pressed botanical art. She organized the Princess Grace Foundation, which funded arts education and the performing arts in Monaco and later in the United States. She participated in poetry readings. She had always loved poetry, had memorized more of it than most people do in a lifetime, and had a reading voice of unusual quality, low and precise and capable of holding a long line without breaking it. She made one film during the Monaco years, a 1977 documentary called Rearranged, in which she narrated scenes about flower arrangement. She narrated a documentary about Monaco called Once Upon a Time, is now in 1978. Neither of these is what Hitchcock meant when he asked her to come back. There is a version of her story that describes the Monaco marriage as happy. There is another version that describes it as dutiful. The truth, as reconstructed from the biographies that proliferated after her death and from the accounts of people who knew her well, is probably that it was both in different proportions at different times, as most long marriages are, but that the specific shape of its unhappiness had to do with the fact that she had given up a life's work, not just a job, and that she spent the rest of her life finding ways to live alongside that absence. She told one interviewer in the early 1970s that she missed the discipline of working on a role, the months of preparation, the specific focus that film work required, the way it organized time and attention toward a single purpose. She said it carefully, without complaint, in the tone of someone describing a fact about themselves that they have made their peace with. Whether she had made her peace with it is a different question. Her children grew up famous by inheritance, and their lives were, in various ways, very public. Carolyn married and divorced and married again. Albert developed a reserve that read like his mother's but operated differently. Stephanie, the youngest, became something that the Monaco Palace was not built to accommodate. A person of genuine individual appetite, resistant to management, constitutionally unsuited to the role her birth had assigned her. Grace's relationship with her youngest daughter was loving and complicated and unresolved at the time of Grace's death. On September 13, 1982, Grace was driving on the D37, a mountain road above Monaco, descending from Rock Aigle, the family's country house, toward the palace. Stephanie was in the car. The accounts of what happened are not entirely consistent. What is established is that the car, a Rover 3500, left the road and fell about 120 feet down the hillside. Grace suffered a stroke, either before or during the accident. The medical findings were disputed and remain somewhat unclear. She died the following day, September 14, 1982. She was 52 years old. Rainier did not remarry. He wore his wedding ring until his own death in 2005. Whether this was grief or loyalty or the particular stubbornness of a man who had organized his life around a specific arrangement and could not conceive of a different one is not something the record resolves. The Oscar she won in 1955 sat in her parents' home in Philadelphia for years after her death. Jack Kelly had died in 1960, before any real reconciliation of the distance between what he had wanted from her and what she had done instead. Whether he ever told her he was proud of her, not of the prince, not of the title, but of the country girl, of Rear Window, of the work, is not documented. Margaret lived until 1990 and gave interviews in her 80s that were gracious and guarded in equal measure, the way the family had always communicated about things that mattered. The 4 films Grace Kelly made in 1954 and 1955 still play. Rear Window holds up as well as anything Hitchcock made. The Country Girl is better than its reputation suggests. Dial M for Murder is tight, exact craft. High Society is what it is. The complete run of work she produced between 1951 and 1956 is 11 films. 11 films in 5 years, starting from nothing, ending at the top. That is the whole of it. People who were there for the filming of Rear Window remember her as disciplined and funny and somewhat unknowable. Present without being legible, warm without being open. Stewart said she was professional in the best sense, meaning she never made problems. never needed things from her colleagues that weren't in the script. Hitchcock said, more than once, that she was the best actress he had worked with, and Hitchcock had worked with a lot of people. He said it without the qualification that tends to accompany male compliments of female performers. He meant it technically. What she might have become, had she stayed, is a speculation that gets rehearsed periodically by film historians and then set aside because it doesn't resolve. Actresses who were her contemporaries and stayed in the industry had complicated, uneven later careers, the industry's relationship with women over 40 being what it has always been. She might have had a decade of great work followed by smaller roles. She might have found the Meryl Streep path before Meryl Streep found it. She might have burned out, as some people with her particular combination of intensity and restraint tend to do when the work stops feeding them. The speculation is genuinely open. What is not speculation is that she made the choice herself. The Kelly children had all been raised to understand that will was a tool and that tools are for using. She used hers. She looked at the open door and the Oscar and the Hitchcock offer on the table and the Monte Carlo Palace waiting. And she made the calculation that she made, and she stepped out of one life into another. Whether she spent the next 27 years glad of it, or sad of it, or somewhere in the middle in a way that shifted with the season, is probably the question that the 40,000 words of biography written about her since 1982 are still circling without quite landing. She was 26 when she held the Oscar. She was 27 when she left. The film she gave up Marnie for was never made, not by her. The movies she might have made after Marnie are a list with no films on it. What she left behind is 11 films and 4 decades of people watching them and wondering what she knew that they don't